On the night of August 18, 1972, 6 men were killed across a stretch of flat, waterlogged land in the Mississippi Delta, a place where the soil was rich, the labor was cheap, and ownership had always belonged to someone else. They died quietly, no crowds, no riots, no warning sirens in the distance. They were taken from porches, kitchens, and bedrooms, shot at close range, and left where they fell. By sunrise, cotton pickers would drive past some of the bodies without stopping, unsure whether what they were seeing was real or just another story they didn't want to be involved in. The men who died owned land. Their names appeared on deeds filed at the county courthouse, on tax records, on loan agreements with regional banks. They controlled thousands of acres between them, land worked by families who had never owned a single square foot of it. The men who killed them did not own land. They were sharecroppers, black men whose families had lived on the same tracts for generations without ever receiving proof that the land beneath their feet belonged to them. They were the Turners, 3 brothers, 2 cousins, all raised on the same fields, all taught the same lesson early: work hard, keep quiet, and maybe, one day, the land will be yours. The motive was not theft, it was not robbery, it was not revolution. It was a deed that never came. A document promised for decades, referenced in conversations, acknowledged by witnesses, and always delayed until the men who made the promises were dead or powerful enough to deny they had ever existed. When Mississippi investigators later reconstructed the case, one of them described it in language that never appeared in court records. "This wasn't rage," he said. "This was a bill they thought had been paid and found out never was." To understand what happened that night, you have to understand the Delta, not as a region, but as a system. In 1972, the Mississippi Delta still functioned on a structure built before the Civil War and perfected afterward. Vast stretches of land owned by a few, generations of black families tied to those acres through debt, labor, and agreements that were rarely written down. The land was flat, broken only by drainage canals, dirt roads, and power lines drooping under the heat. In summer, the air pressed down so hard it felt like weight on the chest. The smell of wet soil, fertilizer, diesel fuel, and rot clung to everything. The Delta did not forget easily. It remembered who owned land, it remembered who worked it, and it remembered where everyone belonged. The Turner family had lived on what was known locally as the Red Willow Tract since 1911, 4 generations. They cleared it by hand. They planted cotton when cotton still mattered. They buried relatives at the edges of the fields because transporting bodies elsewhere cost money they didn't have. They paid rent in labor. They paid debt in crops. They paid loyalty in silence. By the time Isaiah Turner became the head of the family in the 1940s, he believed he understood the rules better than his father ever had. The rules were simple. You work long enough, reliably enough, and quietly enough, and eventually the landowner rewards you, not publicly, not officially, but with a promise. Isaiah Turner received that promise in the late 1950s. The landowner at the time, Earl Whitcomb, was aging, childless, and increasingly dependent on the Turners to keep his acreage productive. According to multiple witnesses, Whitcomb told Isaiah more than once that once the outstanding balance on the Red Willow Tract was settled, the land would be turned over to the family. Not sold, not leased, given. Isaiah believed him. He began paying differently, saving receipts, keeping ledgers. By the late 1960s, Isaiah had done what no Turner before him had managed to do. He cleared the debt. Neighbors knew it. Other sharecroppers talked about it quietly. Even Whitcomb's associates acknowledged it, verbally. But the deed never appeared. Every time Isaiah asked, he was told the same thing. Next season, after harvest, when the paperwork is ready. In 1969, Earl Whitcomb died, and the promise died with him. The land passed to a loose group of Whitcomb relatives and business partners, 6 men who now controlled the Red Willow Tract. They had no personal history with the Turners, no emotional attachment, no reason to honor a promise that was never written down. When Isaiah Turner went to the courthouse, he was told no such agreement existed. When he produced receipts, he was told they proved nothing. When he asked for arbitration, he was told there was no case. The men who now owned the land told the Turners they could continue working under new terms or leave. Isaiah did not live long enough to see what happened next. He died in 1971, believing he had failed his family. His sons did not share that belief. They believed something else, that the system had never intended to give them land, that waiting longer would not change that, and that the promise had only ever existed to keep them working. By the summer of 1972, Caleb Turner, the eldest son, stopped going to the courthouse. He stopped arguing. He stopped asking. Instead, he started visiting family, quietly, after dark. He spoke to his brothers, Henry and Joseph, and to 2 cousins who had grown up on Red Willow like sons of the same household. He did not raise his voice. He did not talk about violence. He repeated the same sentence every time. They're not giving us what's ours. No one argued with him. They all knew it was true. What made the realization dangerous was not anger. It was certainty. Anger burns hot and fast. Certainty settles in and stays. The Turner brothers had grown up watching men older than them bow their heads at settlement time, accepting numbers they knew were wrong, because challenging them only made next season worse. They had watched their father carry ledgers like scripture, believing that proof would eventually matter. They had watched neighbors disappear from the land one by one, replaced by machines or by younger families willing to accept harsher terms. By the early 1970s, the Delta was changing just enough to feel unstable, but not enough to feel fair. Mechanization was creeping in. Cotton pickers replaced hands. Landowners no longer needed as many families tied to their fields. The old incentive to keep sharecroppers hopeful was fading. Promises stopped being useful. And that was the moment the Turners understood they had been living inside a story that had already ended. Caleb Turner was 38 years old in 1972. He had been born on Red Willow, delivered by a midwife in a house that no longer stood. His earliest memories were of walking behind his father through cotton rows, learning how to spot bad soil, how to feel for moisture with bare hands, how to tell when a crop would fail before anyone else admitted it. He had never lived anywhere else. Neither had Henry or Joseph. School ended early for all of them. Labor did not. They learned to drive tractors before cars, learned how to keep books because debt demanded it, learned how to speak to white men carefully and briefly. Caleb learned something else, too. He learned to listen. When the land changed hands after Whitcomb's death, Caleb paid attention to who benefited. He watched which names appeared together at the courthouse. He listened at feed stores, at church parking lots, at the edges of conversations not meant for him. The 6 men who now controlled the Red Willow Tract were not partners in the way people imagined. They were aligned for convenience. Some were related by blood, others by business. All of them understood the same thing. The Turners had no leverage. They owned nothing. The landowners raised rent, adjusted terms, changed credit arrangements. They did not threaten. They did not need to. The pressure was quiet. When Caleb spoke to his brothers, he did not frame it as a fight. He framed it as arithmetic. He told them, "We've paid, we've waited, they know it, and it still doesn't matter." Henry was younger, less patient by nature.
He had been the first to talk about leaving, about going north, about factory work. But he had children, and the Delta had a way of punishing those who left by erasing them from family history. Joseph was the quietest. He said little, but when he spoke, people listened. He had been the one who sat with Isaiah Turner during the final months, listening to his father repeat the same regrets. "I should have gotten it in writing," Isaiah had more than once said. Joseph never forgot that sentence. The cousins, Samuel and Robert Turner, had grown up on adjacent plots. They shared the same debts, the same hopes, the same exhaustion. When Caleb spoke to them, he did not need to explain much. They had reached the same conclusion on their own. The deed was never coming. The realization did not immediately turn into a plan. It turned into something slower. They stopped believing in the future. That shift changed everything.
Men who believe tomorrow might be better behave differently than men who are certain it will not be. They stopped compromising. They stopped negotiating. They stopped imagining themselves inside the rules. By July of 1972, the Turners had stopped talking about the courthouse entirely. They talked instead about who owned what, who lived where, who had been present at which conversations, who had denied the agreement, and who had benefited from that denial. They were careful not to speak about this around women or children, not because they were ashamed, but because they did not want witnesses to their thinking. Words spoken too widely in the Delta had a way of traveling. What they did not discuss openly was violence. That idea arrived on its own. It crept in through history. Every Turner knew the stories, everyone in the Delta did, about men who had disappeared, about nights when the balance shifted briefly before snapping back into place, about how power was enforced when challenged. Violence was not foreign to them. What was foreign was the idea that it could be deliberate, contained, and final. By mid-August, the landowners made a decision of their own. They informed the Turners that the Red Willow tract would be reassigned at the end of the season. Another family would take over part of it. The Turners could stay on reduced acreage or leave entirely. It was delivered calmly, officially, as if this was an ordinary business adjustment. Caleb did not argue. He thanked them for telling him. That was the moment the waiting ended. On the evening of August 18th, the Turner family gathered at the homestead under the pretense of a regular supper. The air was heavy even after sunset, mosquitoes thick enough to swat. Food was eaten quietly. Children were sent to bed early. No one said what was about to happen. They did not need to. The men left separately, some on foot, some in borrowed trucks. They moved across land they knew better than their own houses, following paths worn by decades of labor. They carried weapons they already owned, hunting rifles, shotguns, nothing new, nothing purchased for the occasion. The first landowner lived less than a mile away. He recognized Caleb Turner when he stepped onto the porch. That recognition did not save him. And once the first line was crossed, the rest followed with terrifying efficiency. Each man was taken where he lived, no speeches, no shouting. Some pleaded, some did not have time. By the time the last body fell, the Delta was still asleep. The Turners returned home before dawn. They washed, they sat, they waited. They knew what came next. They also knew they would not run, because running would mean admitting they were wrong, and they no longer believed that. Morning came slowly over the Delta, as it always did, with mist lifting off irrigation canals and the sound of engines starting in the distance. For a few hours after the killings, nothing looked different. The land did not react. The fields did not register what had happened on them.
That was always the Delta's great deception. Violence could pass through it without leaving a mark anyone was willing to acknowledge. The first calls began just after sunrise. A man driving to check his soybean fields noticed a body near a drainage ditch and stopped his truck at a distance, uncertain whether what he was seeing was real. Another landowner's wife went to wake her husband and found the bed empty, the front door open. A third discovery came from a farmhand who arrived early and found his employer lying beside a pickup truck, keys still in his hand.
By mid-morning, it was clear this was not coincidence. 6 men, 6 properties, all connected by ownership lines that traced back to the same tract of land. The sheriff's office understood immediately what this meant, even if no one said it out loud. There was no need to speculate about motive. Everyone in the county already knew where the fault lines ran. This was not random violence, this was directed. Deputies moved cautiously, not because they expected resistance, but because they understood the implications. Mississippi in 1972 did not have a clear script for what to do when the old order was challenged so directly. State investigators arrived by early afternoon. They photographed bodies, interviewed neighbors, mapped locations. The pattern was obvious even before the evidence was complete. Every man killed had either inherited, purchased, or otherwise acquired interest in the Red Willow tract after Earl Whitcomb's death. Every man had denied the Turner family's claim. There were no signs of robbery. Wallets were still in pockets, watches still on wrists. The violence was purposeful, not chaotic. Witnesses came forward quickly, too quickly. The Delta had never been a place where secrets stayed buried long once something broke the surface. People talked, quietly, carefully, but they talked. Names surfaced, descriptions aligned, routes were traced. By late afternoon, law enforcement vehicles were parked at the edge of the Turner property. They did not rush in, they waited. The sheriff stepped out first. He was a tall man in his 60s who had been in office long enough to remember when sharecropping contracts were signed with handshakes instead of lawyers. He had known Isaiah Turner. He had known Earl Whitcomb. He had watched this situation ferment for years without ever touching it. When Caleb Turner walked out of the house, the sheriff did not reach for his weapon. "Caleb," he said. Caleb nodded. "You know why we're here?" "Yes, sir." There was no attempt to deny anything, no confusion, no panic. The brothers and cousins followed him out, hands visible, expressions flat. They were arrested without resistance, loaded into separate vehicles, and driven away on roads they had walked their entire lives. As they passed through neighboring land, people stood and watched, some with anger, some with fear, some with something closer to understanding. The news traveled beyond the county by evening. Jackson picked it up. Memphis followed. By the next day, the story was being framed in headlines that struggled to contain it. 6 landowners killed in landlord shooting. Sharecroppers arrested in overnight slayings. No headline mentioned the deed. That came later. The Turners were held without bail, questioned separately. None of them recanted. None of them blamed the others. When asked why they had done it, Caleb gave the same answer every time. They took what wasn't theirs. That sentence unsettled investigators more than any show of anger could have. There was no apology in it, no bravado, just finality. The trial was scheduled for the spring of 1973, delayed repeatedly as motions were filed and the venue debated. No county wanted to host it. Every courthouse felt too close to the land itself. When the trial finally began, it drew attention far beyond Mississippi. Civil rights organizations sent observers, agricultural unions watched quietly,
Federal officials monitored from a distance, careful not to provoke the backlash that had followed similar cases in earlier decades. The prosecution presented a clean case: 6 dead men, multiple weapons, eyewitness testimony, admissions of involvement. This was murder, planned and executed. The defense did not dispute the facts.
Instead, they told a story that made many people in the courtroom uncomfortable. They called witnesses who testified about verbal agreements made over decades. They produced ledgers kept by Isaiah Turner, documenting payments and balances. They described how sharecropping worked in practice, not theory. They did not argue that the Turners were innocent. They argued that the system had been. The jury listened in silence. When the verdict came, it was unanimous: guilty. Sentencing followed swiftly. Life for Caleb, long sentences for the others. Mississippi did not hesitate when making examples, especially when the old order felt threatened. As the men were led away, there was no shouting in the courtroom, no chaos, just the sound of chains. Outside, reporters asked questions that could not be answered cleanly. Was this justice? Was it vengeance? Was it inevitable? No one could agree. And the Delta, as it always had, absorbed the moment and moved on. In the weeks after the arrests, the Delta settled into an uneasy quiet. Fields still needed tending, loans still needed paying. Harvest did not wait for history to catch up. But something had shifted beneath the routines. Men spoke more softly at feed stores. Landowners avoided eye contact with laborers they had known for years. Deputies drove certain roads more often than others, not looking for trouble so much as measuring its distance. The Turner name became shorthand, not just for violence, but for a line that had finally been crossed. In some houses, parents warned their children never to speak it aloud. In others, it was spoken only at night, when the day's work was done and the truth felt safer in the dark. For the families of the 6 men who were killed, grief came mixed with disbelief. They had believed themselves untouchable in a way that no law ever stated, but everyone understood. Land ownership had always meant safety. It had always meant distance from consequences. That illusion shattered overnight. Widows attended funerals watched by armed deputies. Sons inherited land that now felt heavy instead of secure. The dead were remembered as hard-working businessmen, fathers, pillars of the community. Very few mentioned the Turner family during those services, not because the connection wasn't known, because acknowledging it meant acknowledging the debt. The Red Willow tract sat untouched for the rest of the season. No new family moved onto it. No announcements were made. The land lay quiet, cotton overripe in places, weeds creeping in where labor had once been constant. It was the closest the Delta ever came to pausing. Caleb Turner spent his first weeks in jail replaying conversations rather than actions. He thought about his father at the kitchen table, receipts spread out like evidence that would never be accepted. He thought about the last meeting with the landowners, how calmly they had told him the land was being reassigned. What stayed with him most was not the killings. It was the certainty that nothing he had done would bring the deed back. That truth settled in slowly. By the time his trial began, Caleb no longer spoke about land at all. When reporters asked him why he had done it, he did not talk about history or systems or injustice. He said only this: they made the decision first. Mississippi courts did not recognize that kind of reasoning, and neither did history, at least not officially. But unofficially, the story took on a life of its own. In neighboring counties, sharecroppers talked about it in hushed tones. In union meetings, it was referenced without names. Among landowners, it prompted new paperwork, clearer contracts, fewer verbal promises. Not because of sympathy, because of fear. The bloodletting did not spark reform. It did not redistribute land. It did not dismantle the system that created it. But it did something else. It reminded everyone that the Delta's balance was not guaranteed, that the patience it relied on had limits, and that when those limits were crossed, the response would not be polite, legal, or reversible. By the end of the year, the Red Willow Tract was quietly absorbed into a larger holding. Corporate interests replaced individual names. The land was folded into an operation too distant to make promises at all. That, in the end, was the Delta's solution. Remove the possibility of hope. Remove the expectation of ownership. Remove the reason to wait. What happened on August 18, 1972, did not disrupt the system. It clarified it. And that clarity lingered long after the trials ended and the headlines faded. Prison did not arrive all at once for the Turner men. It came in pieces.
First, there was the holding period. Weeks of concrete rooms, fluorescent light, and waiting without clocks. Then the transfers, one by one, to different facilities across the state. The separation was intentional. Mississippi Corrections understood the value of isolation, especially for men whose strength had always come from family. Caleb Turner was sent north to a maximum security unit built far from the Delta's flat land. Henry and Joseph were sent elsewhere. The cousins were placed in different institutions entirely. Letters traveled slowly. Visits were rare. When they happened, they were short and wordless, conducted through glass that reflected faces back at themselves. The shock wore off faster than anyone expected. What remained was routine. Caleb adjusted the way men who have spent their lives laboring often do. He worked when work was offered. He kept his head down. He spoke carefully. Guards described him as compliant, distant, and difficult to provoke. He never spoke about the killings unless asked directly. When asked whether he regretted what he had done, he answered the same way each time. "I regret believing them." That answer followed him for years. Henry Turner did not adjust as easily. He carried anger into confinement and paid for it. Fights, solitary confinement, disciplinary write-ups, the kind of record that lengthened sentences in small, invisible ways. He spoke openly about the land, about promises, about how none of it mattered now. That openness made him enemies among inmates who had their own versions of the same story. Joseph Turner withdrew almost entirely. He wrote letters to his mother until her death, then stopped writing altogether. When asked why, he said there was no one left who needed to hear from him. Outside the walls, the Turner family fractured. Women who had spent their lives in proximity, sharing labor, child care, grief, were scattered by necessity. Some moved north to be closer to prisons. Others left Mississippi entirely, choosing anonymity over memory. Children grew up visiting fathers through glass, learning how to speak carefully and briefly. Some learned to resent the men who had taken everything from them. Others learned to resent the system that had left no other ending. None of them inherited land. That fact sat beneath everything else. The families of the 6 landowners struggled in different ways. Some were buoyed by insurance settlements and inherited holdings. Others were less fortunate, discovering that land rich in appearance did not always translate into liquidity. Widows became managers overnight. Sons took on responsibilities they had never expected to shoulder. What they shared was the loss of certainty. They had believed the Delta's hierarchy was fixed, that land ownership placed them on the safe side of history. After 1972, that belief weakened. They installed better locks, hired private security, stopped making informal arrangements. The system responded not with empathy, but with fortification. In the years that followed, sharecropping continued to disappear, not because it was unjust, but because it was inefficient. Corporate agriculture absorbed smaller holdings. Labor became seasonal, contractual, and temporary. Ownership consolidated upward.
The Turner case did not cause that shift, but it accelerated its acceptance. By the time Caleb Turner reached his 10th year inside, the Delta he had known no longer existed in the same form. Fields were larger, workers fewer, promises rarer. The deed that had started everything never appeared, not in court, not in archives, not in private collections. It existed only in testimony and memory, as the Turners learned, was not admissible evidence. Decades passed. Caleb Turner aged into prison the way men do, gradually, quietly, losing strength without ceremony. His hair grayed, his hands stiffened. He stopped marking time by seasons and began marking it by transfers, lockdowns, and the occasional letter that reached him after months of delay. He died inside in the late 1980s. No family was present.
Henry survived longer, released eventually into a world that had no use for him. He found work sporadically, stayed nowhere long, and spoke about Red Willow only when pressed. He died in obscurity, his story carried only by those who remembered the name. Joseph lived out his sentence. When asked once, near the end, whether he believed it had been worth it, he paused for a long time. "We were already losing everything," he said. "We just stopped pretending otherwise." That sentence never appeared in any official record. By the 1990s, the Mississippi Delta Bloodletting had been reduced to a footnote in legal texts and an anecdote in local memory. It was cited occasionally in discussions about rural violence, about race, about land reform, then quickly set aside. It made people uncomfortable because it resisted simplification. The Turners were criminals. The system had wronged them. Both statements remained true, and neither canceled the other. As the years passed, the Mississippi Delta Bloodletting of 1972 began to change shape in the public imagination. At first, it was spoken about plainly: 6 men killed, 5 men imprisoned, a crime that shocked a region accustomed to violence that stayed hidden or one-sided. But as time moved on and those directly involved aged or died, the story softened at the edges. Details blurred. Motives were simplified. Responsibility was reassigned depending on who was telling it. In some tellings, the Turners became symbols of lawlessness, proof that social order depended on strict enforcement and clear punishment. In others, they were framed as desperate men, pushed beyond reason by a system that had never intended to include them. Most people preferred not to tell the story at all. Silence was easier. Court transcripts gathered dust in county archives. Newspaper clippings yellowed and cracked. Younger generations in the Delta grew up hearing only fragments, often stripped of context. 6 men died. Sharecroppers went to prison. End of story. But the land remembered more clearly than people did. Survey lines drawn after the case remained rigid, precise, and unforgiving. The Red Willow Tract was absorbed into larger agricultural holdings, managed by companies headquartered hundreds of miles away. Decision-making moved out of the Delta entirely, replacing local power with distant authority. The old relationships, exploitative as they were, disappeared. With them went the illusion that patience might one day be rewarded. For many former sharecroppers, this was not progress, it was erasure. They were no longer promised land, they were simply no longer needed. The Turner case became a reference point in quiet conversations about that shift. Older men would say, "That's when it ended," without specifying what "it" was. Younger listeners often assumed they meant violence, but what they meant was the last remaining fiction, that the Delta's system, however unfair, still offered a path forward if one waited long enough. After 1972,
Waiting lost its meaning. Legal scholars occasionally revisited the case, usually in footnotes. They debated whether the Turners' defense strategy had opened the door to broader discussions about economic coercion and delayed justice. Most concluded it had not. The law did what it always did in such situations. It focused narrowly on the act, not the conditions that produced it. That narrowness protected the system from scrutiny. It also ensured the story would never feel finished. In the 1980s and 1990s, as conversations about civil rights expanded beyond voting and segregation into economics and property, the Turner case resurfaced briefly in academic circles. It was cited as an example of agrarian violence or racialized land disputes, language that sounded analytical but felt distant from the human cost. No one was interviewed. No families were consulted. The story remained theoretical, stripped of voice. Those who had lived through it noticed the difference immediately. The Delta had never been abstract to them. It was sweat, debt, heat, and hunger, not terminology.
By the time the Turner grandchildren were adults, the case had become something they carried rather than something they discussed. Some avoided Mississippi entirely. Others stayed, tied to the land in different ways, working seasonal jobs or managing small operations that bore no resemblance to what their grandparents had known. When asked about their family history, many chose not to answer, not out of shame, out of exhaustion. They had inherited a story with no safe ending. Meanwhile, the families of the 6 landowners adjusted to a Delta that had become quieter, more corporate, and less personal. Their losses remained real, but their position within the system remained largely intact. Land ownership continued to offer insulation, even if it no longer carried the same sense of permanence. Time did what it always does. It redistributed attention. By the early 2000s, the Mississippi Delta Bloodletting of 1972 was rarely mentioned outside of specialized contexts. It did not inspire movies. It did not become a symbol in popular culture. It existed in a narrow space between crime and history, too complex to simplify and too uncomfortable to mythologize. And yet, the questions it raised did not disappear. They simply went unanswered. What happens when justice is endlessly deferred? When promises are used as tools rather than commitments? When systems rely on patience without ever intending to reward it? Those questions lingered beneath newer conflicts, newer disputes, newer inequalities. They were no longer tied to Red Willow alone. They had become portable. The Delta changed, but the structure of power did not vanish. It adapted, learned from its own vulnerabilities, and made sure future promises were fewer, clearer, and harder to challenge. In that sense, the bloodletting accomplished something unintended. It taught the system how to protect itself better. And it taught everyone else that waiting had limits and consequences. Decades after the bloodletting, the Mississippi Delta still had no agreed-upon way to talk about it. Ask a former deputy who worked the case, and he would tell you it was simple. 6 murders, clear evidence, law applied as written. Anything beyond that, he would say, was an attempt to excuse the inexcusable. Ask a former sharecropper who lived nearby, and the answer would stretch longer. He would talk about the way debts never disappeared, only rolled forward. About how promises were made in voices meant never to be recorded. About how the courthouse was never a place where people like the Turners were expected to win. Both stories were true, and they could not be reconciled. This is where the case becomes hardest to sit with, because it refuses to stay inside moral categories that feel safe. It does not allow a clean villain and a clean victim.
It insists on occupying the space between. The Turners were not heroes. They did not seek change through law, organization, or collective action. They chose violence, planned it, and carried it out knowing exactly what the outcome would be. They also acted in a vacuum. Every decision they made had a history behind it, stretching back generations, reinforced by institutions that relied on delay, ambiguity, and exhaustion to maintain control. In that sense, the bloodletting accomplished something unintended. It taught the system how to protect itself better. And it taught everyone else that waiting had limits and consequences. Decades after the bloodletting, the Mississippi Delta still had no agreed-upon way to talk about it. Ask a former deputy who worked the case, and he would tell you it was simple. 6 murders, clear evidence, law applied as written. Anything beyond that, he would say, was an attempt to excuse the inexcusable. Ask a former sharecropper who lived nearby, and the answer would stretch longer. He would talk about the way debts never disappeared, only rolled forward, about how promises were made in voices meant never to be recorded, about how the courthouse was never a place where people like the Turners were expected to win. Both stories were true, and they could not be reconciled. This is where the case becomes hardest to sit with, because it refuses to stay inside moral categories that feel safe. It does not allow a clean villain and a clean victim. It insists on occupying the space between. The Turners were not heroes. They did not seek change through law, organization, or collective action. They chose violence, planned it, and carried it out knowing exactly what the outcome would be. They also acted in a vacuum. Every decision they made had a history behind it, stretching back generations, reinforced by institutions that relied on delay, ambiguity, and exhaustion to maintain control.
That diffusion was its strength. It was also its weakness. Because when harm is spread thinly enough, no one feels compelled to stop it. People convince themselves that the damage is not their doing, that it will resolve itself, that someone else will intervene. In the Turner case, no one did. Not when Isaiah Turner first asked for his deed, not when receipts accumulated, not when land ownership quietly shifted. By the time violence arrived, every earlier opportunity had already been missed. That does not make the outcome inevitable. It makes it comprehensible. This is the distinction many people resist. Understanding is not the same as justification. But refusing to understand does not prevent repetition. It only guarantees surprise when the pressure finally breaks through. The Mississippi Delta Bloodletting forces a confrontation with a truth that remains uncomfortable even now, that systems which rely on patience without accountability are not stable. They are volatile. They store resentment the way levees store water, invisibly, until the moment they fail. And when they fail, the damage does not respect moral boundaries. It spills outward. The families of the 6 landowners carried their grief into futures that were materially secure but emotionally altered. Trust did not return easily. Fear lingered longer than anger. The Turner family carried something different, a mixture of shame, defiance, grief, and exhaustion that did not translate well into public narratives. They were remembered either as monsters or symbols, rarely as people. Both framings erased parts of the truth. Over time, the Delta learned to speak about the case in abstractions. Those times were bad. Things were different then. We've moved on. But moving on did not mean resolving. It meant burying. And buried stories have a way of resurfacing when conditions resemble those that created them. That is why the Mississippi Delta bloodletting still matters, not as a cautionary tale about violence, but as a warning about neglect.
because violence is loud, visible, and punishable. Neglect is quiet, normalized, and rarely addressed, and it lasts longer.
Older residents pointed out places where houses had once stood, where families had gathered, where the Turners' children had played. Younger ones saw only open space, unaware of what had been erased. That erasure was not accidental. It was efficient. As agriculture modernized, stories that complicated ownership were inconvenient. It was easier to flatten the past than to confront it, easier to treat 1972 as an anomaly rather than a culmination. Occasionally, journalists returned to the story, usually on anniversaries. They interviewed experts, quoted court records, and summarized events in tidy columns. Rarely did they speak to descendants on either side. The living aftermath was harder to capture than the facts. Those who did speak often said the same thing. It didn't end when the trial did. They were right. The bloodletting fractured families in ways that could not be repaired by time alone. It taught children lessons no one wanted to teach, about trust, about patience, about how the law worked differently depending on who you were. It also taught the Delta something it did not want to learn, that land, when treated as leverage rather than responsibility, could become a weapon, that promises, when used strategically, could do as much harm as force, and that ignoring injustice did not neutralize it, it transformed it. As decades passed, the Mississippi Delta Bloodletting became less about 6 men and more about what followed, about who stayed, who left, who remembered, and who benefited from forgetting. The land remained, people moved on, but the silence carried weight. When the Mississippi Delta Bloodletting is placed beside other acts of rural violence in American history, it does not stand out because of its scale. 6 deaths do not compare to riots, massacres, or open rebellions. What makes it endure is how ordinary it was, how little spectacle it required. There were no speeches, no crowds, no ideology shouted into the night. Just men who believed every formal avenue had already failed them, acting with the same deliberation they had once applied to planting schedules and harvest accounts. That pattern appears again and again in places where power is exercised slowly and impersonally, where ownership is distant, where justice is procedural rather than felt, where delay replaces denial because delay looks reasonable. In those places, violence does not erupt suddenly, it accumulates. The Mississippi Delta did not explode in 1972. It released pressure that had been building since long before any of the men involved were born. The Turners were not unique in their anger. They were unique only in their refusal to keep carrying it. What followed reinforced the lessons systems tend to learn from moments like this. Not that conditions must change, but that conditions must be managed more carefully. After 1972, land agreements became clearer, not fairer, but clearer. Promises were written less often. Verbal understandings disappeared. Everything moved onto paper designed by people who understood exactly how it would be interpreted. This reduced conflict. It also reduced hope. Across the Delta and beyond it, similar transitions were taking place. Small operators gave way to corporations. Local disputes gave way to contracts governed elsewhere. The human friction that once produced confrontations was replaced by distance. Distance made violence less likely. It also made injustice harder to see.
The Turner case was never cited as a reason to reform land access, credit structures, or generational inequality. Instead, it became a cautionary example, used quietly by those in power. This is what happens when patience ends. The message was not meant for the dispossessed, it was meant for administrators. As long as people believed there was still something to wait for, order could be maintained. Once that belief collapsed, consequences became unpredictable. This lesson did not stay in Mississippi. Versions of it appeared in coal country, in migrant farming communities, in places where labor remained invisible until it stopped. Each time, the details differed. Each time, the underlying mechanics were the same. Promises deferred, ownership withheld, legal pathways narrowed until they became symbolic. Eventually, someone decides the waiting is over. The danger is not that this happens often. The danger is that when it does, everyone acts surprised.
The Mississippi Delta Bloodletting should have been understood as a failure long before it became a crime. It should have prompted questions about how many similar pressures existed elsewhere, unseen and unaddressed. Instead, it was compartmentalized, crime punished, story buried, system preserved. That preservation came at a cost that is harder to quantify. It taught communities that justice was something external, delivered late or not at all. It taught families that ownership mattered more than fairness. It taught children that waiting without leverage was a gamble with terrible odds. And it taught institutions that silence could absorb almost anything, until it couldn't. The case remains a reminder that stability built on exhaustion is not stability at all. It is inertia, resistant to movement until it is suddenly overcome. And when it is overcome, the result is rarely constructive. There is no clean ending to the Mississippi Delta Bloodletting of 1972. No document resurfaced years later to change the verdict. No confession reframed the story. No reform followed that could be traced back to that night and measured as progress. The land endured. The system adapted. The people paid. That is the shape of the ending, whether anyone likes it or not. When historians look back on cases like this, they often search for lessons that can be applied safely. They ask what could have been done differently, which policy might have prevented it, which intervention might have redirected events. Those questions matter, but they miss something essential. This was not a failure of imagination. Everyone involved understood what was happening long before the violence occurred. Isaiah Turner understood when he kept receipts no one would honor. The landowners understood when they inherited a promise they never intended to keep. The courthouse understood when it treated delay as neutrality, and the Delta understood when it looked away. The killings did not reveal a new problem. They revealed one that had been normalized. That is why the story still unsettles people who hear it in full. It refuses to stay in the past. It refuses to be explained away as ignorance or chaos. It insists that responsibility was widely distributed, thinly enough that no one felt compelled to act, thickly enough that the outcome was inevitable once waiting lost its meaning. The Turner men died labeled as criminals, and they were. They took lives, planned it, and accepted the consequences. Nothing in this story erases that. But nothing in this story allows the system that shaped them to walk away untouched either. That contradiction is the point. Because when injustice operates slowly, politely, and legally, it rarely produces dramatic resistance. Most people endure it quietly. They adjust, they compromise, they wait, until someone decides not to. And when that happens, the result is never justice. It is always tragedy. The Mississippi Delta Bloodletting of 1972 stands as a reminder that delay is not a neutral act, that promises are a form of power,
and that systems which depend on patience without accountability eventually produce outcomes no one claims responsibility for. The land did not change hands the way the Turners hoped, but it did change the way everyone understood what waiting costs. And that understanding, once learned, never fully disappears. If this story felt heavy, that's because it was never meant to be consumed lightly. These are not stories of monsters hiding in the dark. They are stories of ordinary people making irreversible decisions after years of being told to wait, to trust, to believe that the system would eventually do the right thing. Sometimes it doesn't, and when it doesn't, the damage rarely stays contained.
The Mississippi Delta Bloodletting of 1972 was not about 6 men and a deed. It was about what happens when justice becomes conditional, when promises replace rights, and when delay is mistaken for fairness. Those conditions are not unique to one place or one time. They exist wherever power is quiet, ownership is distant, and accountability is optional. If you find yourself asking what you would have done, that question has already done its work. There is no correct answer, only the recognition that systems fail long before people break. These stories matter not because they explain violence, but because they expose the cost of ignoring it until it arrives. If you want to keep examining stories like this, stories where the truth is uncomfortable and the conclusions are unresolved, take a moment to reflect, share your thoughts, and keep the conversation alive. Because silence is never neutral, and waiting, as this story shows, is not infinite. Like the video? Hit subscribe and stay tuned for the next story. Thanks for watching.